So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for your attention. Our panel session is going to handle the topic called Filling the Infrastructure Gap in Emerging Countries. We have heard from several speakers this morning talking about how huge the infrastructure gap is, not just in emerging countries, but in the world. COVID-19 has battered economies everywhere, but the effects are worse or are going to be worse in emerging countries. We had some speakers here in the morning talk about decarbonization, but in many countries in the developing world, there's nothing to decarbonize. If they don't already grow enough food, if they don't already generate enough electricity, what is there to decarbonize? Okay? If they can only power a few cities and villages and homes, what's there to decarbonize? So we're talking about two worlds and, very different needs. But I think the most important question that we have to answer this afternoon is who is going to pick up the bill? It's a huge bill. The African Development Bank estimates that Africa's infrastructure financing needs will top $170 billion by the year 2025, with a gap of around $100 billion. And that's very huge. Countries in Africa and in the developing world cannot do it on their own. So who is going to pick up the bill? And my panel is going to help us answer that. And I am pleased to welcome Gregory Ness. He's the Executive Director of the Project and Export Finance team at Standard Chartered Bank. Gregory has many years of experience as a finance analyst. Gregory, please. And joining us also is Mary Mazou. Mary is the Deputy CEO at STOA. STOA is an investment fund created in 2017. And they finance new and existing infrastructure projects in developing countries. I learned today that 50% of their projects are happening in Africa. If you're here and you're from or conversant with Malawi, Cameroon, Nigeria, or South Africa, you probably have come across a project being financed there by STOA. Mary? And we have Alain Thibodeau. Alain is the Chief Economist at the West African Development Bank, or BOAD. And Alain too has decades of experience as a finance analyst. Thank you very much, Alain. And last but not least is Sandrine Dolivar. Sandrine is a partner at Asafo and Co. She just prefers to be called a lawyer. They are lawyers. They're the guys that take care of the legal things. So thank you very much. We're going to be answering two broad questions this afternoon. And the first is, what kind of infrastructure is needed in emerging countries? And I want to ask Alain from the West African Development Bank to help set the stage for this discussion. Alain, what are countries telling you? What are you learning from them? What kind of infrastructure do they need?
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. The question is actually a good one, because 20 years ago, same question, a lot of answers were about road construction. At that time, our countries needed to build a lot of roads in order to facilitate the trade, the transactions, the goods across our countries. I think this is now behind us today, and this is especially more important in the post-COVID area. Today, a lot of demand of infrastructure have to do with agriculture. Looks like in our countries, the productivity of our agriculture is too low. All governments realize that it's time now to improve it. And this means that a lot of demand for infrastructure related to agriculture, which we can understand because food security is probably priority number one in our region, where population is, you all know, is multiplying by 2 every 20 years. So we need to feed people, to better feed people. And the second thing is to provide infrastructure in agriculture means that we have to deal with energy, with telecommunications, digital, internet. Actually, everything is related to this demand. So it's, I would say, a tough one.
It's a tough one. So we have had the needs have been changing over time. And so and so financing those needs has also been changing and has to change, which is why I want to bring in Mari now. So it's no longer the traditional forms of financing infrastructure needs in Africa that so many years ago it used to be the duty of governments to finance infrastructure in these emerging countries. But things have changed now. Governments can't do this job alone, which is why you exist as STOA.
Yes, thank you. I think in terms of infrastructure gap, I think the needs from country-wise is rather different from one country to the others. I think what we observe is that it takes a long time to develop a big project like the one we have developed, Nachtigal, for example, as an hydro dam. But that fit a lot of needs of the population in terms of meeting demand gap by 2024 at affordable price, and basically providing base load, which, when you are in Cameroon, you see a lot of shortcut and shortage of electricity. But what we have observed also is that apart from these big projects over the past 2 years, and especially during the pandemic, we've more invested in what I would say infra-like projects that deliver, that are capex intensive over time, but that are more closer to the business or to the client. And that's translates into, for example, fiber to the home, fiber to the office services. And we do have a project in South Africa that has achieved its business plan schedule in terms of home pass in 2023 by the end of this year. So meaning that there has been a huge increase in terms of demand and ability to roll out fiber to the home and fiber to the office. And I think that will, continue. We've also seen in the energy sector more what we call distributed energy towards, commercial services, a commercial bank, for example, or also industrials. And an example was the closing of Destar we invest in, which is a platform that deliver, power with storage in Nigeria to businesses. But we also see with the increase urbanization in those megalopoles, which have nothing to do with, European one in terms of size and in terms of need, economic free zone or industrial parks. So dealing with logistics and also dealing then after with the last miles. I think that taken place, and Hogan has just published, I think, a study regarding the economic free zone and also these industrial parks that are more and more becoming, relevant to serve big cities. So that's, I think, an evolution in terms of project types. We do have a big project where we look long term. And where we will be, and I'll come back, where we'll be able to take development risk on part with strategic partners and with the government. But likewise, we also see more private initiatives, which are more private equity-like projects, but with huge capex need, where we invested on part with other partners.
So before I go to Gregory, I would like to just mention that we'll be coming to you, our lovely audience, for a brief Q&A. So if you have a question or comment, please get it ready. We would like to hear from you before this session wraps up. Gregory, we've heard about the needs by emerging countries, but they are not, we're not simply saying, okay, build a road there, build a hospital there. There are other things to consider now. Resilience, how bankable the project is. And your focus at Standard Chartered Bank is Africa. How do you see, from where you sit, how do you see investing in African infrastructure projects? What's going to change about investing in these projects from your point of view as a bank?
Thank you. That's right. Africa is a core focus for our bank, as in many other emerging markets. And you're right, there's been, I guess, with the pandemic and some of the changes around the crisis, a general market relook at what type of infrastructure you're financing or how you invest in terms of the longer term needs. So it's been a bit more about possibly sustainability and the long-term economic value of these projects which are being invested in, because what happened pre-pandemic was a lot of investment came outside of the equity, but through the debt side came in very many indirect ways. So you had a lot of these financings happening at the Ministry of Finance levels or Treasury levels, which during the pandemic, you had the Paris Club matters, the IMF bailouts, et cetera, which put in huge focus the sovereign debt ceilings of these countries. You know, we had many downgrades, Gabon, Angola, things like that, which have been very much a focus. And so from the procuring agencies' point of view, they've been pushing a bit more for these projects to be a bit more at the asset level, as in PPPs, trying to see if there's collective solutions where you can push down the financings, the equity and debt to the project level effectively. So do like a PPP where you're amortizing the cost of that debt over long term. That's not something you can just do overnight, obviously. Some countries have thought about this for several years, have legislation in place. Others don't, quite frankly. They don't have a lot of people in their procuring agencies or assistance, even for multilaterals, to do that. So there's areas where they have to work and areas where they don't. But I guess the point is there's much more scrutiny about, is it sustainable? Is this project or this transaction or this asset that's being financed, is it going to be there for the long term? Is it going to go through election cycles? Are we going to have to come up to a situation where we're renegotiating a tariff that was negotiated on a PPP or on a power tariff, for example? That's happened in many countries where the energy prices are being rediscussed. And that's about the confidence for the investor, right, as well as for banks, because in the end of the day, you're part of Africa, part of those nations. You cannot, just declare force majeure and go to arbitration. That's the last resort in the end. You do have those legal protections, and I'm sure our fellow panelists will be able to talk about the legal implications, but in the end of the day, you're there for the long term of these, assets. So I would just say one other thing is, one other area of very much a focus is ESG, sustainability, focus everywhere for everyone globally, for us for sure, in terms of what we're financing, offshore wind in Taiwan, in Europe, et cetera. Big focus for us, yet for Africa, it's a very different dynamic. It's not really as much about investing in climate change, if at all, because it's not that paradigm is just not there. Much more what people see in Africa is the gas infrastructure still, which has had an investment for the last decade or so, getting that off the ground. You can see in Nigeria, for example, stopping the flaring, getting the gas distribution in place. That's taken a very long time. And that is that transition fuel to something more sustainable versus coal, which we had in, SADC region historically. So there's a different timeline and a different discussion about climate change for Africa, that it's a different basis upon which, that change is happening. So that's why I just wanted to say that, gas infra is hugely important. And when a lot of these lenders suddenly stop overnight funding, or even equity providers funding, gas overnight, EIB, EIF, CDC, et cetera, it's a big problem for these developers who spent tens of millions of dollars preparing projects, and suddenly overnight, they don't have a project anymore.
Gregory talks about investor confidence, and it's a very important point. Emerging markets are shunned because of the perceived and sometimes real risks that exist. And Sandrine, you are a lawyer. How do you go about the uncertainty, the risks that exist in these emerging markets, and the investors that want to invest in their infrastructure needs, but also the real needs, infrastructure needs of these countries?
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Just to begin, I want to thank you and to thank Paris Europlace for inviting me to speak about these very essential topics. Because as you said, and as the other speakers said, in fact, the bankability of the project is the main issue here. And also, investors must be confident in investing in projects in Africa. And that's not, it's a tricky issue in some countries, because even if there are some tools, legal and contractual ones, there are reforms, legal frameworks, and very well drafted laws, and also decrees. There are some issues regarding bankability of the projects, and there are still many questions from investors when they want to invest in Africa. So from a legal perspective, and as a lawyer, we clearly see in this gap, the infrastructure gap. We also observe the will of public entities to reduce this gap, and to do it, as it said, from a sustainability perspective. So the challenge is twofold. There are sectors considered as priorities, which are urban mobility, energy, digital infrastructure, data centers, but also clean water, sanitation, ports, road, social housing, and health infrastructure. The pandemic highlighted the weakness of the continent's digital infrastructure, and we see that governments are aware of this challenge, and regional plannings and also national development plans or projects, pipeline of projects, are increased on these aspects. We also see a strong willingness to develop infrastructure in consideration with the sustainability criteria, but also with another main issue. All these development must take into account public budgetary constraints, but also local content. So there are so many challenges of filling in the infrastructure gaps, and at the same time providing answers to the global issues of ecological transition and sustainable development, that from a legal perspective, we strongly advise that each project must be studied at a very early stage in order to answer and to structure the deal in a good way.
Okay, thank you very much, Sandrine. I would like to come back to you, Alain, there's something that you are doing in the countries under your jurisdiction, something called the Joliba Initiative that I would like you to talk to us about. But before you do that, there has not been a lot of private sector finance flowing into African infrastructure projects. We must say that it's getting better, but it's not very good yet. What can be done to spur more private sector investment in the countries where your bank works?
Yes, you're right to point it out. The private financing are not that obvious in our region. And most of the financing are public or coming from World Bank or IMF or all the DFIs. Reality, when you talk to the private investors, they complain about a sort of lack of visibility. And this lack of visibility has partly something to do with the moving world of technology. I'll give you an example. We have a lot of projects related to solar energy, which in our region makes sense because the sun is free, it's every day, there's no question about that. But as Marie-Laure was saying, and I totally agree with her, when you start to finance one of these kind of projects, it takes you 3 to 5 years before to complete the project. And the 5 years down the road, you find out that the batteries that you put in your project are already out of date. And the thing is, private investors, they just don't understand. And if 4 years later you just start to rebuild the project, they don't have no trust. They don't have trust anymore with you. So this technology barrier is a key point. And part of our job is to provide some advisory to the governments who present the projects. And sometimes we encourage them to delay, to defer some projects because we know that just waiting 6 months or 12 months, we may have a better project, better technology to embed in the project. So I think to address your question, the more it goes, the more we are familiar with technology and the more confident private investors will be with us. I think the reason is if you input the state of the art of technology, it's sort of reference which make that a lot of investors, including the private investors, understand where you're going. They can follow you, it rings the bell with what they've seen elsewhere in Asia or in Europe. And this is what we don't have so far.
Gregory, does the approach need to change? I mean, the way the private sector approaches, financing projects in developing countries, does the approach have to change? Do you place too many conditions on your finance?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when you look at from a lender perspective, once a transaction is finalized in a lot of these jurisdictions, emerging markets, frontier markets, the terms and conditions can be quite onerous. As in sponsors will tell you they feel like they're in a straitjacket. They have to get waiver after waiver. It's very difficult. And Marie-Laure knows the project that we're still getting waivers on 3 years later.
Every drawing.
Yes, sorry about that. But the point is, I guess, there is a lot of, because of the intense scrutiny around the projects everywhere, the enhanced due diligence, and effectively because a lot of these transactions are done as club deals. The problem you have in Africa and other emerging markets is there isn't really syndicated approach to these debt transactions. You don't really have a lead arranger who would then syndicate to others. you know, as you get in Europe, right? You may have a club of 25 lenders, but there's only 1 or 2 underwriters. In Africa, everybody's at the table, and everybody can put their voice in and tell you exactly what they want. And so you automatically go to the lowest common denominator across whatever your 15 lenders want against you. So there's a bit of an issue with how the market is driven from a club basis. So there needs to be more work across lenders to have a more streamlined, organized approach to this, as you do in developed markets, but also on the documentation, which is a bit more too granular and too specific to each case. So there are certain elements we can take away. But I would also say, I mean, that's largely, I guess you would say this from the DFIs. Commercial banks act a bit differently. They are much more commercial. They are relationship driven, obviously. So they are more flexible in those matters. And what can also help in this case is you do get a lot of DFI funding, but to promote more private investment from international lenders or local lenders, et cetera, regional, it has to be a case of more of a marriage between the development community and these private entities, as in, instead of giving $1 of DFI money into a project, why don't you give a counter guarantee to a private lender to give that $1? Because you know what, the World Bank, they give $1, it's $1 of the sovereign ceiling taken away. If they use their guarantee, it's only 25 cents of that sovereign. So it's better for the country in the end, in terms of the limits they have against these multilaterals anyways. So if you're able to provide that credit enhancement tools, which a lot of DFIs, multilaterals have been doing, you know, there's 3 or 4 of them, then you will enhance and grow much more that market. It will not be just a handful of international lenders. It will, you know, grow, and all those benefits of a deep liquid market will then fulfill this infra gap that we have in Africa. So I think there needs to be a lot more work between multilats, international banks. What can we do? The MIGA cover, for example, we use MIGA a lot, but the problem is whether we have MIGA or not, it makes no difference to our balance sheet treatment in terms of how much equity or risk-weighted assets you put against it. There's a bit of an issue as well with how the regulations work versus what these credit products are supposed to do. So there's a lot more work, to be frank.
Yeah, I come back to your comment, Gregory, and I guess, yes, in terms of syndication, there is certainly some lesson from DFI and multilateral to learn from the commercial bank in terms of how to get confidence against each other and not just look at the small common denominators, because obviously what it translates into is that the SPV and the management, you know, just focus on administrative and answering to hundreds and hundreds of answers instead of just focusing on the key, you know, a real key concrete construction risk in a project, in a greenfield project, for example, and how to solve them to meet both costs and the calendar, which I think for me is key. I think what also is difficult is that is also done by back office that are scrutinizing and pencil, you know, the documentation from home, and that have not, you know, a concrete view of what is happening on ground every day, every single day, and just, you know, asking for hundreds and hundreds of questions without making priority. So I think there is, I understand that from a regulatory perspective, there's been more and more cumbersome and constraint against those institutions, but they need to be a more balance between what is essential from what is secondary to ensure that the project goes live and go to COD up to the expectation, and you know, basically allowed the management and the shareholder also to concentrate on key issue and key aspect, because that will also translate sometime into, you know, investor not willing to invest anymore because the time they're spending in terms of just managing the small nuts is very painful, I can assure you. But we managed it so far. So what we have since then us consider on our side is that to help filling the gap is trying to find good bankable inclusive, transparent, and well-governed projects that are in development stage, to develop on part with partners and industrial that have quite deep pocket money and that we can accompany up to the closing. As you mentioned, it's 3 to 5 years. It's almost 4 to 5 years and even more time to develop this project with our money at risk for that time and with no insurance that we will get closing. So it means a lot of efforts on that aspect to do that, but we in STOA have a pocket to do that. We have not mobilized it at the beginning because we had to basically be visible and establish a track record to be able to engage in that area. We will start. We have started this year to mobilize it, and we will not look at big elephants. We are very strict in terms of selection of this project, and when we engage into this project is to basically allow on part with the industrial and the governments when they are directly involved, is basically look at the feasibility study first and the what we call APS and APD in terms of the technical aspect of the project on a preliminary basis and then on a detailed basis before we issue the tender, the EPC tender. We will also most likely focus on what is become essential, and this is the year for nature in terms of biodiversity, with the ability to establish the right method and the right framework, not only to avoid or restore, but also compensate approach, because that has become essential, and basically the value of the assets long-term will have this, there is something to count on how you frame the compensation or the restoration of biodiversity for your project long-term and the valuation of your assets long-term, as well as what we look at is the resilience. We don't want to build infrastructure that will not be maintained long-term and that will not be back to the government.
Sorry, I'm going to cut you short. Marie, Sandrine,
okay.
You want to make a point, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. But I'm sorry, but I totally agree with what Marie-Laure said, and also Greg and also Alain, because what of the main issue is the timing on projects, the financing, of course, but also the timing, and to deal with important issues. Because, and our work as advisors, our lawyers, when we try to negotiate a contract in order to advise on a project, is to point out the main issues, the main legal issues, the main administrative issues, but also the main contractual issues or financing ones. Of course, we need to use tools, legal tools, sorry for that, but risk matrix are very important at the very beginning of the project, but also timesheet of contract. It's very difficult to work on a contract without any timesheet, and it could be surprising to say it like that, but it's not often the case to have a timesheet before a contract. We often see a MOU, and after that, the contract, the concession contract or the PPP contract. It can be difficult to deal with that. And we also try to help our clients to find the good way of negotiating, the good bidding process, and here we could speak about the competitive dialogue, as for example, which is a very important tool for such big projects. And we try to also take into account that today public entities are very interested in fast-track proceedings, fast-track projects. Investors need that, banks need that, but also international institutions needs that, and lawyers also. The project, it's key for the project to go fast. There are some proceedings in public procurement called fast proceedings in order for investors to bid for projects. There are a new type of proceedings, such as unsolicited bids, which are very interested also. And we also try to make it possible. I just want to point out one thing. We can see as practitioners that very few greenfield infrastructure projects, apart from the renewable energy sector, benefit from pure project financing. In Africa today, we can observe that big projects still benefit from international aids from DFIs, but also from loan agreement from Exim Bank. And you can imagine what kind of Exim Bank finance these big projects. I think we need to have to face with this challenge as practitioners, but also a public entity need to think about it. I think the project financing in Africa could be developed, but there is the issue of securitization of the project, and also to have a very business-friendly, framework in order to develop that.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to come to you, our audience. I would like to know if you have any questions or comments to make from the points that our speakers have made so far. Do we have any? Please go ahead.
I just wanted to know whether there has been some recent acceleration of the processes in Africa. Yes, I just wanted to know whether there has been some acceleration in the recent process in Africa, or whether it's stable since 2 or 3 years. On projects, of course. You didn't hear my question, did you?
Not really, no.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm going to repeat it. I just wanted to know whether in the recent year, maybe 1 or 2 years, there has been some acceleration in the way to process projects, or whether it's stable. Maybe the pandemic biased the situation, but will it accelerate in the future? Are you optimistic, in fact?
I can take that one.
Okay.
Just a quick one. Yes, I can say that yes, we changed the way to process. We decided, you were referring to Joliba, our business plan for the next 5 years. We decided now to concentrate our operation in 5 sectors, only 5 sectors, but we know everything in the sector. We go big in each sector, so then we can provide good advisory, then we can follow, then we can make the process more simple. Just to give you an example, for instance, the management of guarantees, the guarantees collaterals we required, much less today than it used to be 2 years ago. So answer is yes, and we have to do it. And the way to do it is the more you are concentrated, the more you are simple, the better. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with that. And just add that there are many reforms from a legal perspective on PPPs in order to accelerate the development on projects in Africa. We can speak about the very recent reform in Senegal in March 2021, a new bill on PPPs, and also in Kenya, where we can observe that there are many legal and contractual new instruments in order to develop this sector, and we hope that it will work.
Okay, so before I bring in Mary, I would like to know if there's another question or comment. Please.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Philippe Wynn. I work for Actis. We're an investor in Africa, in utilities. We can see some situation where the utilities are heavily subsidized. You know, the electricity tariff or the water tariff could be strongly, I should say, not bankable actually if they don't have subsidies. So there is a lot of benefit to attract private sector investment in terms of improvement and bringing more FDI or whatever to the sector. But the problem of those subsidies is something that is not bankable for the private investors. So do you have an idea how to solve this problem? Did you answer my question?
Thank you. Mary, do you agree?
I think it would be difficult because I think the environment, water and waste sector have been what I would call the parent pauvre, I think, in the infrastructure in Africa. We are making our own environmental road today. And frankly speaking, I had discussion with some colleagues and partners working, for example, in our big utilities, saying that there has been less in 10 years, 5 or 7 tender on the water sector in Africa. So how, and it's more affairage, I think linked to basically operation of the concession than I think capex-driven projects. So and the reason for that is that effectively the sector is heavily subsidized, is very sensitive in terms of because you serve critical needs to the population, and you cannot afford just shutting down water distribution to the end user or to your local population or counter some issue. So I think this sector is particularly difficult to deal with, at least on the distribution side. I think we will much more focus on the water treatment plant, on the more upfront production of water and treatment of water or waste. And even waste is even, I think, much more an issue, because when you are able to pay $2 or €2 per ton to treat, your waste in Africa, and it's on Earth, and sometimes is with some, different treatment. That is to be compared with 10 and more in Europe. So how people can afford such, a differential is very complex so far. And however, whole this waste area are just producing a number of dioxide carbon every day, and are the one that are where we need to do something to change, the curve, clearly.
Okay, Gregory, very briefly, what's your take? You have a water project underway in Angola, right? And as we wrap up, if someone is in this room now and wants to finance a project in Africa, what do they have to come to you with? You're the money guy. Very briefly.
I would say project preparation is key. It takes a lot to prepare it properly. I think we probably see 15, 20 projects, maybe only 1 or 2 will really go ahead. So it's very much selection of which project. So you need to be absolutely spot on with your deal selection from the developer sponsor point of view. And you need to put a lot of work in to make sure that it works from the outset, that you don't just take a format from whatever the government's put out and just assume that you'll fix it along the way. You need to fix it up front, make sure it's properly feasible, feasibility studies, it's bankable, et cetera. So I would say as well, a lot of the big sponsors bring in advisors early, legal, financial, all the consultants, that kind of thing, to make sure it's all well wrapped in a proper way. So I would just say that you have that gestational period before you actually come to the lending market, because once you go to lenders, you need to make sure it's properly put together and that you don't have a failed project from a lender perspective, right? The worst you can do is have a project which you tried to get lenders in and finance, and it hasn't worked. you have to go back to the drawing board, or you would have spent a lot more time as a sponsor working on it and realizing we've gone the wrong way, and you spent all that development dollars, right? So it's very key just to think about your financing plan, because if you get stuck with, you know, the whole world of development banks around the table throwing in everything they want, then you're back to that issue of a straitjacket of terms and conditions on, and your life will be hell for the next 20 years of your project anyways.
Thank you, Gregory. Mari, as you make your brief closing remarks, you've spent about $300 million of your capital in Africa, right? What's been your experience so far, and what are you going to do different going forward? Very briefly.
I think. So we started almost 4 years ago. So we have now engaged more than half of our 600 million, primarily in Africa. The route was great at the beginning because as a starting point, you know, everything is always fine when we start to invest. Now we're going into concrete. We have gone into pandemics. Certain transactions were closed during that period. And, you know, sometimes it's quite shaky. So we have also to adapt to the situation. Certainly with certain volume risk, you know, materializing and needing some restructuring or flexibility given by the lenders. Some, you know, with force majeure and delay occurring because the pandemic has not allowed to deploy the as calendar. Sometimes because you have new regulation on foreign exchange taking place, whereby you have to repatriate your euro into the country in ZAR, and then you're stuck with your ZAR and you have to pay your EPC with ZAR. So it means also that, you know, this market is evolving, and even if we have tried in our project to do the best to imagine what can happen on the paper, the reality is often different, and it needs a lot of flexibility from every parties around the table. Certainly the management team that is trying to find out the right result, but the shareholder, but also the lending parties. Because, you know, what we have written is not what will happen in reality. So clearly, the next stage that we will experience is not only on our side some early development, new investment, because we engage around 100 or 120 million euro per year of new money, but also managing our project and going sometimes into difficulty. But thanks to our shareholder with quite a long-term view and quite being pragmatic with some background also experience before to find the right solution. Because ultimately we need to deliver the infrastructure, and we'll only get paid, everyone around the table will only get paid if it goes into operation.
Okay, over to you, Sandrine, now. There's a pandemic, new risks. What's going to be done different going forward?
To be done different, I think just in 3 words, preparation, also anticipation and adaptation, in fact. There is no magic tool, in fact, I guess. But if the project is well prepared, if all the parties are absolutely aware of what is needed and what type of financing is needed, I think everything can be discussed. But I don't know if the pandemic is a new risk. You know, there was some diseases before the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think, as Gregory, Marie-Laure said, preparation and anticipation are keywords for projects in order to invest in Africa.
Alain?
I would say most important today is to make sure the resources are there for a long time. We did long-term resources, we did cheap resources, and we need good advisory. I think with these 3, we'll make some progress.
I'd like to thank you, Alain Chibozo from the West African Development Bank, and Sandrine D'Oliver from ASAFO and Co, and Marie-Laure Mazou from STOR, and last but not least, Gregory Ness from Standard Chartered, and to thank you, our beautiful audience, for your company. Thank you very much.